Hey guys, welcome back. So these are macromolecules and a few other things. So let's start off with carbon. Carbon, as we know, is an element on the periodic table, and carbon is the main thing that makes up all of the macromolecules, and we'll learn what macromolecules are later. But carbon has a lot of very unique properties. So the first one is that carbon has, in the structure, it has 4 valence electrons. These 4 valence electrons allow for it to bind 4 different times. And because it can bind 4 different times, carbon can bind with almost every other element in the world. And that's why carbon makes up all of the other macromolecules, because it can bind with so many different elements. The second unique property of carbon is the fact that it can make double or triple bonds. As you can see here, the carbon is made a double bond with another carbon and also other bonds with hydrogens as well. And you can also see how it makes a triple bond and then another singular bond with hydrogens. Here, this carbon is making 2 bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is making 1, 2, 3, 4. And then same 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's still making 4 different, it's still making 4 bonds, but it's making a double or a triple bond. Because they can bond a lot of times, they can make long hydrocarbon chains in which the carbons, they bond with each other, but then they also bond with hydrogens, which are called hydrocarbon chains. And the last one is that they can create ring structures because carbons can bind with themselves, so it may end up creating like a ring type structure. Now that that's done, let's talk about the 4 main types of macromolecules. The first type of macromolecule is called carbohydrates, okay? And so its monomer, or like its individual building blocks, is called monosaccharides. And when we talk about macromolecules, we talk about molecules that have like things that have like a lot of molecules, a lot of bonds and elements and compounds and things like that. So the monomer of carbohydrates is monosaccharides. And there are 4 main types of monosaccharides. You have 1, glucose, 2, fructose, 3, galactose, and 4, ribose. And glucose, fructose, and galactose are all 6 carbon molecules, whereas ribose is a 5 carbon molecule. So the unique roles of carbohydrates is one, that they act as markers / identifiers in the cell to recognize self cells versus foreign cells. And so it's kind of like it'll know whether it's the body cell or a foreign cell, like something from outside. Second one is that it provides long-term energy. This is in the form of either glycogen in humans and mammals, or starch in plants. So when us humans, we eat too much glucose, or like we eat too much sugar, then our body starts storing it as glycogen. And if someone is like on a diet, then if they're cutting back on their glucose intake, their body will turn to the glycogen, which is a long-term storage of energy. And that's why people lose weight, because they're losing that glycogen. And when you have an over of glycogen, it's diabetes. Carbohydrates can also be in the form of short-term energy, and this is in ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate, as seen in the structure, it has a 5 carbon sugar in the middle. This is 5 carbons. And then we have an adenine group, and then we have 3 phosphates. And ATP is short-term energy because when it holds its energies in these individual bonds, and when it wants to release energy, it breaks off the bond between the second and the third phosphate group, and in that breaking of the chemical bond, it releases energy. And the ATP can be recycled because when this releases energy, it allows for another phosphate group to be added onto, which is how it stores energy, and it's a constant cycle. That's how it's always recycling. And the last role of carbohydrates is the fact that it can help build structures. In animals, it's called chitin, which is in animals is exoskeleton, like in turtles. In turtles is shells is made of chitin, and also in cellulose, which is found in plants, which helps in structures of plants. That was the first macromolecule, carbohydrates. The second macromolecule, named proteins, is its monomer is amino acids. Okay, so the amino acids, it is made up of a central carbon, this central carbon, an R group, which is the circle up here, a carboxyl group or a functional group, and then an amino group, which is the nitrogen and then the hydrogen, the two hydrogens, or it's also known as N-terminal. And then this is also known as C-terminal. And these there's 20 different types of proteins found. 10 out of 20 are essential acids, which our bodies cannot produce and we need to consume them. And the other 10 out of 20 our bodies may make if we have the materials. And all the different types of amino acids, they have the same base structure, which is the amino group, the central carbon, and the carboxyl group. But what makes them unique is the R group, because it's special to each type of the 20. And that's why, because proteins have 20 different types, proteins have the most variety out of all the macromolecules, and it's also the most abundant. And the reason why proteins are the most abundant is because it takes on so many roles. And let's talk about the different roles. So proteins have 7 different roles, okay? Number 1, protein can be used for for long-term energy, but this is only after the body uses its carbs and lipids, then it will turn to proteins for energy. The second one is that proteins, a type of proteins, are enzymes, right? Enzymes help speed up chemical reactions. And let's take a little detour right now and talk about enzymes. So enzymes are types of proteins that speed up chemical reactions by lowering the amount of activation energy. What is activation energy? Activation energy is the amount of energy needed to start a chemical reaction. And it does this in 3 ways. The first way is that the enzymes, they physically bend or break bonds, and it separates atoms. The second way is because they bring atoms so close together that the electrons are forced to create covalent bonds. And the third way is by creating a favorable microclimate. And an example of this is that enzymes that help the stomach, it'll make the stomach more acidic so that the stomach can digest more. And the way that enzymes, they bind and do this speed up chemical reactions is through this is the structure, right? So you have an enzyme, right? And an enzyme, each enzyme, it's unique. It has a unique different it kind of it's a lock and key model. So this has these types of grooves, right? And each enzyme is very specific on what substrate will bind with it. Substrate is just a reactant. And so it's very specific because these grooves have to fit inside those grooves. And this area where the substrate is going to bind to is the active site. And when you physically ruin the active site of an enzyme, this is called the denaturization of enzymes, and then the enzyme does not work anymore. Back to proteins. So we had energy and we had enzymes. And then the third role of proteins is that transportation in the cell membrane, specifically in the cell membrane, because occurred on the phospholipid bilayer, we see things like integral proteins, which allow which are like channels that allow material to go in and out of the cell, like especially like small polar molecules to like go in and out of the cells. An example of this is aquaporin, which helps water. Fourth role of proteins is our immune system, or they're in the form of antibodies, and those help fight diseases in our bodies. 5, they're found on the cell membrane, and they work like the peripheral proteins. They work as identifiers of self versus outside cells, and that's why a lot of times transplants will fail because like the body is so used to knowing that like that's my cell, and so when you try to transplant foreign cells into the body, they might fail because the proteins are rejecting the foreign cells. Sixth one is transportation throughout the body. An example of this is hemoglobin, which is a protein that carries oxygen, and it carries oxygen in our blood and throughout like our whole body into all the different parts of our body. And the last role of proteins is movement in muscles. And so we have two like the two proteins that help our movement are called actin and myosin, and they work by collapsing and uncollapsing, or like kind of like joining together and then unjoining together when your muscles bend and stretch, contract and decontract. And that helps movement. And also in unicellular organisms like flagella, like the flagella of like unicellular organisms, how they help the cell move, that's also like proteins. Peptides are bonds between two amino acids, and this is through a process called hydrolysis or dehydration. And how do we see, so it's not hydrolysis, sorry. Okay, so how do we see this happen? So basically, you can see here is one amino acid, correct? This is an amino acid. And then this is another amino acid. And I want to combine these two. How? Well, a hydroxide of one amino acid will bind with a singular hydrogen on another in the amino group of the other amino acid, and because you have one H and an O, H2O, this creates water or dehydration. And then after that occurs, these two peptides will be bonded together. The third type of macromolecule is called lipids. The lipids monomer is a glycerol head with a fatty acid chain tail, okay? And so the fatty acid chain tail is also a hydrocarbon chain. And lipids have some roles, and the first role is long-term storage in like our bodies, like long-term energy storage. And this is after carbohydrates, it's lipids and then proteins. And they also help make up the cell membranes in the example phospholipids, because phospholipids is one of the 4 main types of lipids, and those are what cell membranes are made of. Third type is growth and development. Like the 4th type of lipids are sterols, which help in growth and development in like humans in the form of testosterone and the other one. And another one is that it's protectant or water repellent. And this is because lipids are also seen as waxes, okay? And some animals will actually put waxes, like they will form waxes on their feathers to prevent water from entering in their feathers and having their feathers be weighed down. And the 4th type is in cholesterol, which is also a type of lipid. Fatty acid chain tails, okay? So there's 2 different types of like bonds between fatty acid chain tails. So it's one saturated. Saturated is that in the fatty acid chains, all the bonds of the fatty acid chain are single bonds, and this causes like the lipids to lay flat against each other. And this is seen, and so when this happens, the lipid is solid. So an example of this is lard or butter, things like that, or like waxes. And unsaturated is the opposite, where there's at least one or more double or triple bonds seen in the fatty acid chain tail. That's expressed by this dent, and that is gonna cause the lipids are not gonna lay flat against each other, and that's gonna cause it to be a liquid. For an example, oil. The last type of macromolecule is nucleic acids. So the monomer of nucleic acids are called nucleotides, okay? This is the structure of a nucleotide. You have 5 carbons, you have an oxygen at the top, and then attached to a carbon is a phosphate group, and then you also have your nitrogenous base group. So there are 5 different types of nucleic acids, but nucleotides, because there's 5 different types of nitrogenous bases, okay? And every single type of nucleotide has nitrogenous, a separate nitrogenous base. What are the 5 nitrogenous bases? Well, you have adenine, you have guanine, cytosine, thymine, and uracil. Those are the 5 types of nitrogenous bases. What are the roles of nucleic acids? Well, one is to store genetic information, and this is in the form of DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. And DNA, it stores genetic information in chromosomes and everything. If you want to know all about that, go watch my other video. And DNA does not contain uracil. Just in the bonds of the nucleotides, they don't contain uracil. Second role of nucleic acids is that it transmits and translates genetic information. And this is done in RNA, or ribonucleic acids, which do not contain thymine. And that's when they transmit and translate into the genetic information into something that the body can read and then turn into stuff. So those are the macromolecules. Thank you so much for watching.